Of the three groups journeying to Rome in the aftermath of Germanicus's death and Piso's attempted rebellion in the spring of 20 AD, Tiberius's son Castor was the first to arrive. Having completed his term as governor of Illyricum, Castor and his wife Livilla returned at the head of his victorious legion. His successful campaign against the Marcomanni of Germania had earned him an ovation, a prestigious honor granted by the Senate to celebrate his triumph. This recognition would coincide with his second term as Roman consul, further cementing his position as Rome's rising star, a welcome contrast to the shadow of grief looming over the empire. Because Castor, still holding proconsular imperium, was forbidden to cross the city's sacred boundary until his ovation, Tiberius travelled beyond the Pomerium to meet him. There, the emperor was greeted not only by his son, daughter-in-law and granddaughter, but also by Livilla's twin sons. The two baby boys, named Germanicus and Tiberius Gemellus, Gemellus meaning twin, had been born on the very day that Livilla's brother, Germanicus, had died in Syria. The birth of twins was hailed as a mark of divine favour, a symbol of extraordinary fortune tied to Rome's own founding twins, Romulus and Remus. For Tiberius, the arrival of his first grandsons on the very day his legal heir perished in Syria seemed an undeniable omen, a sign that despite the loss of Germanicus, the continuation of his legacy was assured. Yet, even in this moment of familial celebration, the spectre of betrayal lingered. Castor carried more than the triumph of his son's birth and his conquest of the Marcomanni. He also brought troubling news about Piso and Plancina. Granted safe passage by Gaius Sentius Saturninus to leave Calendaris and return to Rome, Piso's ship had instead veered toward Illyricum. There, accompanied by Plancina and their youngest son Marcus, Piso sought a private audience with Tiberius's son. But Castor, ever the astute statesman, refused to meet privately with an accused murderer and known rebel, a man who might later claim false promises had been made. Piso had clearly sought out Tiberius's son, now positioned as the empire's primary heir, in hopes of securing his support. Castor, however, insisted that the meeting take place before witnesses. "If certain insinuations be true," Castor declared, his voice raised for all to hear, "I must be foremost in my resentment." Then, with deliberate composure, he added, "But I prefer to believe these insinuations are false and groundless. The death of Germanicus need not be the ruin of anyone." Piso, Plancina, and their son Marcus joined Castor's legions on their march back to Rome. Along the way, they encountered the 9th Legion Hispania, recalled from Spain by Tiberius and reassigned to Africa to reinforce the 3rd Legion Augusta in its campaign against the Numidian Berber rebel, Tacfarinas. It was with the Hispania that Piso and his family parted ways with Castor and Livilla, choosing to continue their journey to Rome alongside the newly reassigned legion. Yet, by the time Castor and his legions arrived in Rome, the 9th Hispania had come and gone from the Campus Martius, and there was no sign of Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso. The next to arrive in Rome was Agrippina, Tiberius's widowed daughter-in-law, who brought with her a vast procession of mourners, some of whom had travelled as far as Brundisium. For nearly 2 months, the people of Rome, caught in their unrelenting grief, had awaited the arrival of Germanicus's ashes, devouring every report of Agrippina's progress along the way. As the duly elected consul of the year, Castor, alongside Germanicus's brother Claudius, had led the delegation of senators Tiberius sent to Terracina to escort the ashes on the final leg of Agrippina's journey. However, with the city already overcrowded and emotionally charged, Agrippina's procession threatened to ignite disaster. In response, Tiberius ordered an increase in the number of soldiers stationed in the city and dispatched units of the Praetorian Guard to redirect Agrippina's procession around the city's pomerium, guiding it directly onto the Campus Martius. As the sun set and darkness fell over the city, the torches blazing on the Campus Martius cast an orange hue across the sky. From the small portico he had constructed on the highest point of his Palatine villa, Tiberius could see the glow and hear the shrieks and wails of a nation in mourning. Nearly 100,000 people had gathered to witness the placement of Germanicus's ashes within the mausoleum of Augustus. They had come of their own accord, for Tiberius had declined the Senate's request to grant Germanicus a state funeral. For the previous 3 decades, the funerary excesses of the imperial family had become a competition, an exercise in growing extravagance. Following the death of Marcellus, the nephew and rumoured first heir of Augustus, a library had been dedicated to him by his grieving mother, and a newly constructed theatre along the Tiber River was named after him on the orders of his uncle, with an empty seat of honour maintained for his memory. Marcellus had also been written into Rome's law, immortalized by the poet Virgil. When Lucius Caesar, Augustus's grandson, died in Gaul at the age of only 17, the Senate granted him a fully funded state funeral, despite his lack of a formal governmental position. The death of Gaius Caesar, Lucius's older brother, brought not only the expense of another state funeral, but the minting of commemorative coins and the voting of divine honours by the Senate. This act of deification was extended to include Lucius Caesar as well, though their cults never grew beyond symbolic honours. But this constant competition for posthumous glory drained the state's resources. Augustus alone was deemed worthy of a state funeral. The rest was a waste. Germanicus's death, decided Tiberius, demanded a different approach. Though he had been the heir, Germanicus died in service to Rome, like so many soldiers before him whose losses were mourned quietly by their families across the empire. Unlike the heirs of Augustus, whose passing sparked monumental displays of public grief, Germanicus's funeral needed to set a new standard for imperial mourning, one that would restore dignity and set a proper example for the future. Unfortunately for Tiberius, the Roman people did not agree. The lamentations that echoed against the orange glow of the Campus Martius were growing. The steady din of weeping was suddenly pierced by shrieks and wails, tinged with anger. "Where is Tiberius?" The question rang out, sharp and piercing. "And where is the Augusta? Why do they hide?" Another voice rose from the crowd. "They hide because this is their doing. They dare not show their faces, lest we see their delight." Finally, the ashes were placed in the mausoleum of Augustus. Agrippina and her children then began making their way home, surrounded by throngs of hysterical mourners. From his perch atop the Palatine portico, Tiberius watched as the blazing torches dispersed, and he listened as the masses followed his daughter-in-law through the Forum Romanum. "Hail Agrippina!" they cried, "the glory of her nation! The only true descendant of the god Augustus!" Finally, just days after Germanicus's ashes had been placed in Augustus's mausoleum, Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso and his family arrived in Rome. After parting ways with Tiberius's son, they had travelled with the 9th Hispania for a portion of the journey. Despite the rumours that clung to them, suggesting their involvement in the death of Germanicus, Piso, who outranked the military tribune leading the legions, rode proudly in a slave-borne litter at the head of the column, his wife Plancina by his side. Unapologetic and haughty, they must have been a sight to those soldiers who mourned the death of Germanicus. As they passed through the Apennine Mountains, southeast of Rome, Piso, Plancina, and Marcus broke off from the 9th Hispania. They hired a boat to take them down the Nera River, the waterway that eventually fed into the Tiber, a silent passage toward the city that was both home and, for them, a place of reckoning. As if to make a statement, Piso chose to moor his boat at the small port beside the mausoleum of Augustus, the very spot where, only days before, the Roman people had vented their spleens over Germanicus's demise. Awaiting the arrival of his clientele, summoned by his eldest son Gnaeus, Piso stood unflinching. The air still hung with grief, and in the streets murmurs of accusations drifted like smoke, but Piso paid them no mind. Surrounded by a throng of clients and a detail of armed guards for their protection, Piso, Plancina, and Marcus made their way from the Campus Martius through the Forum Romanum. As they moved toward their home on the Lower Palatine, Piso spoke and laughed boisterously with those they passed, ensuring he was seen and heard by all. Arriving at their Palatine villa, occupied in their absence by their eldest son Gnaeus and his wife and new daughter, Piso and Plancina discovered their house was still decorated for the recently held Matronalia, the festival dedicated to the goddess Juno, celebrated annually at the end of March. While Piso, eager to make it clear that he had returned to Rome and would hide from no one, hosted a lavish banquet at his villa, his youngest son Marcus made his way to the imperial residence to request an audience with Tiberius. There, Marcus pleaded on his father's behalf, swearing that Piso's actions following Germanicus's death had been driven solely by a desire to stabilize the East in service to Rome. But Piso's actions had placed Tiberius in an impossible predicament. Germanicus was dead, and the grief-stricken people of Rome had begun to view Tiberius through the same lens as Piso, clouded with suspicion and resentment. If Tiberius failed to act swiftly, grief could spiral into open unrest and then riots. To protect himself and maintain order, he had to distance himself, not just from Piso, but also from Germanicus and Agrippina. "Tell your father," said Tiberius to Marcus Piso, voice imperiously impartial, "that prosecution is to be commenced against him at once